It's an unseasonably warm day here in San Francisco. It's the great entrance cedar and the beautiful walnut tree that is not yet waking up. We're about 2 days into this moon cycle. It's the eagle moon. Although the phenological relationships and activities of living places and living beings they differ dramatically from place to place. In some places it is still very cold. In the place that I live, it almost never becomes very cold, and it nearly never snows. Though in the long time that I've been kind of stuck here, sort of shipwrecked here, it did do something resembling snowing one time in the 90s. Today it's about 70 degrees. I think we're 2 days into this moon, and the moon is named because the raptors, and particularly the owls, will tend to be mating and setting up nests around this time. Many birds only live in nests when they are mating and producing eggs and young. I'm not clear if there are birds that don't do that. If there are birds that sort of live in nests all the time. And some of the birds, like the crows and ravens and perhaps other corvids, that's a family name, I guess, corvids, they have a special trees they select for nesting. They're very particular about selecting nest locations, and these may have to do with the proximity or non-proximity of other birds. For example, hummingbirds that nest in the proximity of raptors appear to have a much higher successful fledge rate, between 70 and 80%, as opposed to 15 to 23% for hummingbirds that don't nest near raptors. And part of that appears to be because there's a relationship between the raptors, the hummingbirds, and the corvids. Corvids are inclined to prey on hummingbird eggs and children, but they're not inclined to approach very closely to raptor nests. It may be that raptors sometimes attempt to prey on corvid children. It's not clear to me how often that succeeds. The corvids are pretty fierce defenders and are astonishingly aware of the activity, the nearby presence or activity of raptors. But particularly, they don't, well, the corvids are diurnal, so I'm speaking about diurnal raptors like hawks and eagles and kestrels and things like this. Whereas owls may succeed. I don't know a lot about the habits of owls in terms of their, and I'm sure they differ from species to species and place to place. in terms of their capacity to prey on other bird species, and particularly on the young of other birds. The humans are inclined to think about relationships in nature in a kind of tripolar way. Either they're friendly, they're neutral, or they're enemies. My own perspective on that is that the actual nature of these relationships is much more complex. The corvids, crows and ravens, will chase hawks and eagles, but they also seem to have forms of relationship with hawks and eagles and owls that are far more sophisticated than the idea of an enemy. And when they encounter them, they don't so much try to kill them when they encounter hawks or eagles. They rarely try to kill them, which they might be able to succeed at, particularly en masse in a group. Rather, it seems a very complex kind of behavior ensues that to humans resembles harassment, but again is, I think, far more complex than our far too simplistic models could support. And I think this is true of vast domains of natural phenomenon. Excuse me. A long time ago, thousands of years ago, before the relationships with language and knowledge that dominate us today, but those relationships have changed even in the past 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, 300 years, 1,000 years. We've undergone as human beings a very sophisticated array of developmental cycles and what we might be inclined to call progress, but I'm not using the word development here to necessarily indicate progress. I'm using it to indicate transformation. We've undergone change, yeah. And one of my one of the areas of research that fascinates me very deeply is an area often referred to with the phrase the evolution of human consciousness. Excuse me for just a moment. Now again, with the term evolution, we are inclined to think of that as, in general, many of us are inclined to think of that because we're sort of trained to do that by casual conversation and by the habits, the speaking and thinking habits of other people we encounter, common people, even researchers in some cases. When we use the word evolution, we think of progressive development, right? That better benefits accrue over time, which is not, that's a casual use of a scientific term. And when we think of development, we tend to think of the same thing. We think of progressive, beneficial, sophistication. And yet, development can simply mean the transformations over time, right? So that although a human person might reach their prime, so to speak, in their 30s or 40s, development includes old age and death. Development includes the loss of strength, health, faculties, resistance to disease. Development includes aging. So when I'm using this term development or the evolution of human consciousness, that phrase, I'm not merely thinking of beneficial advances. I'm thinking also of catastrophic losses, confusions. It is not in any way clear to me that modern humans, however sophisticated and rational we have become, with the onset of science and the development of industrialization and technologies and computation and so on and so forth, it's not entirely clear to me that those developments represent progress. Particularly if they're disinclined to actually help our species to survive, or far more seriously, if they result in the eradication of the anciently conserved ecologies of Earth, of our species, or even where they result in damage to the potentials and scope of our human intelligence. I think many of us would be inclined to celebrate the birth and development of scientific thought, which certainly did rescue us from a vast array of undesirable thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. Us being a kind of catch-all term, not referring to any specific group of humans, but to humans in general. And yet at the same time, science and technology are extremely dangerous for our species. The results of our scientific discovery and education, the results of our technological sophistication, are in many cases lethal, in that they can misfocus our awareness, our understanding, our relationships, our priorities, and they can produce catastrophic effects in the environment when employed by the supercultures that presently dominate the behavior of our species. So without needing or wanting necessarily to attack science or even technology, what I will say is that Unfortunately, we are like a child who's given something that's developmentally toxic. And children seem to live in a much faster domain of developmental time than adults do, so that even modest exposure in children can produce catastrophic effects that would take much longer term exposure in adults. And I suppose what I'm suggesting is that, well, just to put it simply, we've not yet developed supercultures intelligent enough to enable us as a species to be selective in the ways we employ scientific knowledge and technology, and in the purposes we employ them for. We are in a crisis where it appears that as our capacities for scientific and technological behaviors have increased and become more sophisticated over a relatively extremely short period of time, say 50 years, 60 years, 100 years, if you wish, our social and relational intelligence has paid a devastating price, has undergone an array of unique losses and devastations. And this I expect to continue. So two of the domains of learning that fascinate me are the evolution of human consciousness. What was it like to be, what was the life of the mind like for a person 20,000 years ago? What did they see when they looked at the sky? And they did not have our scientific stories. What did they experience? What were they thinking? What were their concerns? What was the nature of their relationships with each other and the living world? What was the origin of the knowledge they most valued? What did they have in the place that our science and rationality and technology took over? And although there are phases in which we can say, well, they had superstitions, it's not entirely clear to me that in fact, I am quite certain that's not all they had. And much of what we might think of as superstition today, in its native time and situation and place, many of these things were other forms of intelligence. And some of them related to understandings and relationships that we've not only forgotten or misrepresented, we might be incapable of imagining them. If we're never having experienced anything even vaguely similar, we would have difficulty understanding or producing an image or a feeling that would give us a sense of what it was that ancient peoples thought and felt and were motivated by and for. Yet it's clear to me that some of those things were extremely sophisticated, and validly profound. So the evolution of consciousness is one of the topics that have fascinated me, and there aren't a great number, well, I'm not aware of a great number of books on the topic. A couple that stand out to immediate reference are Bruno Snell's The Discovery of the Mind, which is a fascinating idea. It talks essentially about what we might reasonably refer to as the birth of the intellect. Another fascinating and brilliant book, however confused some aspects of it are, particularly perhaps as regards neuroscience, is The Origins of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian. And both of these books had very significant effects on me, the latter much more so than the former. The latter is a true tour de force of somebody I consider to be an incredible prodigy. And the other domain that fascinates me is an array of perspectives that are related to what I will call ways of knowing. Science is a way of knowing. Language imposes certain inclinations on what and how we will know, how we will direct our attention, for what purposes, so on and so forth. Mathematics is a way of knowing. Relationships, to have a relationship with a being or human or group or living place, is a way of knowing. And there are many things, many aspects of human behavior and experience that might qualify as ways of knowing. Some of them relatively narrow, some of them relatively broad. Eating food is a way of knowing. What we acquire from food informs our bodies. Exercise is a way of knowing. Martial arts is a way of knowing. Tai Chi, a way of knowing. Writing is a way of knowing and learning. So there's a vast spectrum of ways of knowing. And some of the ways of knowing common in our ancient ancestors remain in us as unawakened potentials. And this fascinates me. And this is part of why today we have what we call in English religions. And this word can be used in various ways. But religions tend to refer to a very peculiar aspect of our capacity to frame identity. And the aspect they refer to is the ultimate aspect of identity. Religions ask us to believe models of why the universe exists, why there are human beings, what the purpose of our lives and minds are, so forth, so on and so forth. And I believe that what we call religions are the highly structured representational remains of the human socio-cultural and ideational activity of the ancients. As the intellect became more pronounced, and more distinct in the evolution of human consciousness, or the development of human consciousness. So too, religions became more virulent, more forceful, more aggressive, more domineering, and one might even say more hateful. Now, of course, we have weird analogs of religion, or offshoots. There's other ways to use the idea of religion, to believe something to just sort of furiously believe some idea or opinion, regardless of evidence or argument or experience to the contrary, could be understood as a religion. And certain kinds of psychosis resemble an aspect of religious ideation. So there's other ways we can use this word if we're so inclined. We can use it just to mean a very strongly held opinion or belief. I suspect that the modern surviving religions are the developmental children of ancestors whose actual forms and purposes might be very surprising to us, were we able to encounter them. But one thing is clear: humans have been fascinated and compelled by traditions and ceremonies, and by relation, the idea at least of relation with non-human intelligence. Intelligences that we might ordinarily classify as divine. Probably not very long ago, the ideas that surround a philosophy called Eliminative Materialism would have been impossible for anyone to have. You can look up Eliminative Materialism if you wish, but essentially, to put a very clumsy nutshell around it, it's a philosophy that believes that there are no, how should we put it, that there is nothing supernatural, that our minds are little more than the byproduct of the chemical activity of our brains. There is nothing before life, there is nothing after life. The idea of divinity is nonsensical, and that what we have is actually simply a physical universe with processes accidentally produced that we mistake for having domains of identity and meaning that they do not have. And long ago, such an idea would have been impossible to form. By long ago, I mean 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. Once the intellect was born, it was at least conceivable that somebody could, in theory, dispose of the gods. It's unclear to me whether anyone did, or what the birth of eliminative materialism was, but I suspect it was relatively recent. Though there may have been philosophies that at least resembled or were precursors to it. Is there a secret underlying array of intelligences and relationships? Are there secret underlying arrays of intelligences, beings, and relationships, invisible to our common waking thought and experience, but yet somehow accessible to us as human beings. This is a question each of us will have some kind of unique relationship with throughout our lives, and that relationship will be largely, if not overwhelmingly, determined by the culture and time that we're born in, the minds to whom we are exposed, whether or not we can achieve something like escape velocity from the sociocultural baggage that we acquire as we mature in human culture. And lots of other variables, our own inclinations, our own curiosity, our own passion. Accidents, too, can have a huge effect on whether or not we even become concerned with such questions, and to what degree, and for what purposes. Many very intelligent people have become concerned with religion because they see it as a threat, and it's certainly not an unreasonable view. And so they've spent their lives attacking particularly the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Though they are, most of the people who are thusly inclined are pretty happy to attack nearly any actual religion. Not all of the practices that orbit this token religion are alike. And it's not my purpose here to survey them. But there are things, for example, like Zen Buddhism, that maybe ever so slightly resembles a religion in that it has a kind of ceremonial form, and maybe even acknowledges the placeholders of deity-like figures such as Buddha or Tara, and yet at the same time denies the existence of such, fundamentally kind of denies the existence of such things, such beings, and seeks to, it's an array of practices and traditions that seek to break through the mind and perhaps the ego to an experience of the essence of being, which is in Buddhism often spoken of as empty. But it's not mere nothingness, I think. Of course, once I say I think, I'm pretty much screwed in terms of Buddhism, or Zen Buddhism anyway. Perhaps it means something like pure undifferentiated potential, or empty of continuous form. But there's something very clear to me in the history of the evolution of human consciousness, that there are at least two sort of forces or aspects at play over, say, the last 5,000 years. And these aspects do not tend to play well together. One of them is fairly intent on dominating and subsuming the other. And I speak here of the city builders and the nomads. And just because we may feel disinclined to participate in religion, doesn't mean there's nothing useful to learn from studying and understanding it. Not by a long shot. Because in religion and the study of religion, we will find knowledge and evidence that can help us to partly at least reconstruct the evolution of human consciousness. And we can also find stories and metaphors and analogies that are fundamentally important to understanding the nature, conflicts, and symmetries of consciousness, as well as its developmental pulse throughout history. Now, of course, historical anthropology in general, these disciplines are fraught with all kinds of problems. It doesn't mean they should be dismissed. It means that we should be careful how literally we take their maps and suggestions and descriptions, explanations, histories, and so on. They are studies, and as studies, they are attempts to understand or explain the remnants that we can work with in our modern human concerns and contexts, whether they are academic or personal or, cultural, whatever they may be. But it does seem there was long ago, and still to this day, in a sense, a conflict between the peoples who were settled and built cities, and these would be the origins of the supercultures within which we are trapped today, city builders, and the people who traveled and were nomads. And obviously these two peoples are going to have radically different kinds of relationships with other human beings, with the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, particularly Venus, and maybe Jupiter, but also Mars. Some of the other planets may have possibly been visible or in some unexpected way discoverable or familiar to our distant ancestors. And when I say in some way, I don't exclude non-ordinary ways that are not merely rationally explainable. So, the humans who built cities and who were settled and who developed agriculture, settled agriculture, these sort of came into conflict with the peoples who were nomadic, and the former generally had a rather deleterious relationship with the latter, to put it mildly. So if the histories that come down to us through, for example, Judaism, have any verity, if they have validity, then the Jews, a nomadic tribal people composed of, at least at some point, 12 tribes, were repeatedly enslaved over time. most recently in the history of the Tanakh, which is referred to as the Old Testament in English, by the Egyptians. But there's some reasonable degree of evidence that that was not the first time this happened. And of course, in the Americas, probably wildly misnamed place, colonists from Europe came to South and North America and essentially wiped out and enslaved both tribal peoples and the kind of nascent city building peoples that existed at least in South America and conceivably in some parts of North America. Whether or not there was anything resembling cities by the time the colonists got to North America seems unlikely. But there do seem to be ruins that suggest that there was something like settled, broad-scale settlements at some point in North American history in some places. So the city builders would have a very different array of relationships with living places, the land, animals, other human beings. And unfortunately for the city builders, those relationships were inclined to become utilitarian. In other words, they were inclined to become consumers of land and animals. And when one becomes a consumer in this way, crucially important, very sophisticated domains of relationships that would otherwise naturally arise and exist in consciousness, behavior, thought, and emotion disappear. Many of the nomadic peoples had sophisticated ceremonial traditions that don't precisely match our idea of religion. They were ways of preserving and celebrating non-ordinary experience, events, stories, and catastrophes, successes and mistakes that formed the framework around which minds were woven. And unfortunately, for all of the benefits, all of the seeming benefits and profundity of science, it seems to me an insufficient framework around which to weave a living mind. And perhaps a very dangerous one. I walk now in a garden surrounded by the ancestors, the myriadly formed ancestors that are the developmental repercussions of the first moment of life on this world. And there may have been more than one first moment, in more than one place, in more than one time. And we don't yet know whether all of these incredible forms that surround me, these living, embodied intelligences, I call them this, even though some other humans might contest with me and say, that bamboo is not an intelligence, those gnats are not an intelligence. I would happily defend my position if I thought it useful. But not only are all of the living things intelligences, that our own arises only in relation with them. And this understanding that the nature of our own minds and souls, should we have them, and intelligence, is intimately dependent on the living contexts in which we exist, and can be catastrophically damaged when those contexts are turned into pure structure, like cities and computers and screens and so on. These kinds of ideas, I believe, were familiar, meaning of my family, to ancient peoples. They knew that the relationship between the raven and the hawk was not merely enmity. It was something much more sophisticated and complex, and something that had something that represented in the physical, in what we can observe in the ordinary, that was representative of a vast array of non-ordinary aspects that were not immediately visible, derivable from what we might see or think, particularly if we are thinking, for example, like a biologist or an ornithologist. No slight intended. So it seems to me that for all of the profound benefits that science can potentially represent for human beings, it's not yet clear whether our acquisition of this form of knowledge will wipe us out. And if it does, was it beneficial? If our relationships with science and technology result in the devastation of the anciently preserved animals and ecologies with which our own minds arose, and which we require congress with to become and remain intelligent and to develop our intelligence. If our relationships with science and technology wipe those crucial aspects out, were they ever good? Our species is unprepared for what we are referring to as the advancements of science and technology. We're not yet intelligent enough to embody them. And certainly plenty of harm, at least not just against humans, but against environments and so on and so forth, was also caused by religion. There's no doubt that specifically the religions that I spoke of earlier, the Abrahamic faiths, caused vast cataclysms and may yet accomplish the apocalypse apparently predicted in Christianity. How ironic it would be if the sort of prophetic faith turned out not to be so prophetic as it was generative of deadly futures and bad things to come. Certainly, there is the potential for unimaginably constrictive ignorance in the human relationship with the modern religions. And perhaps part of that is because they're inclined to declare what behaviors and activities are good and what behaviors and activities are evil, and to declare these categorically. And certainly many of the things proposed as evil are not very good. But not all of them are not very good. And some of them are evil, but they're not always evil. So it's a very complicated moral and ethical dilemma that religion places us in. On this warm day, there are many ravens sort of playing and cavorting and opportunistically looking for food in the garden. It's nice to see. I like those animals. Very fond of them. Extremely intelligent. But what I was getting at was that I think our ancestors were aware that they were nestled in a field of concentric circles of intelligence, and that the living beings that surrounded them were, in a sense, the embodiments, the natural embodiments of metanatural or pre-physical phenomenon, the precursors to physical phenomenon, the forces that shape and in character physical phenomenon. And for these forces, they had great reverence, and with these forces, they had relationships. And some people who are unwilling to imagine such things will simply say, well, sure, they imagined that the forces that shape the branch and the trunk and the leaf and the wing and the eye and the hand and the mind, forces which should rationally be understood to be physical, perfectly natural and ordinary, they believed those forces, they thought of them as beings, and I refuse to do so. One of the fascinating things about human intelligence and our nature is that we have a profound capacity for diversity. Someone came here and attacked this tree. And it looks like they did so, in fact I'm quite sure they did so with a tool, an implement. It wouldn't be possible for them to have done this much damage with their hands. It seems a very strange thing to do, kind of demented, mean thing to do. I wonder what was in their mind. You can see here evidence of a tool. There are these 4 little holes. Let's see if I can, yeah, there we go. These 4 little holes here. I haven't even discussed the bizarre idea that nature is some fiendishly opposed to human existence, some force that has to be vanquished or conquered. In case it isn't obvious, the conquering of nature leads to the obliteration of human intelligence and humanity. We're not at war with nature, we never were. Though our species has long been relatively vulnerable in that we're big, fleshy, thin-skinned animals without claws, without tentacles, without stingers. We have some relatively strong teeth, but it's pretty hard to use those in combat and get away with it. One of the things that made us formidable was our capacity to project stones and arrows and eventually bullets and then radiation and things like this, missiles. Eventually, at some point in our history, we became skillful throwers of things. And then we learned to augment that skill by producing technologies like the bow. The spear first, and then the bow. And our capacity to make blades out of stones was very important. But in the early days, before we were very good with implements, this would be the very early days, I'm guessing, because implements go quite a ways back with our people, we were vulnerable to predators, and there were huge predators around, like panthers and grizzly bears and lions and tigers and things that would certainly be happy to eat our children, if not our adults. And, our adults too, if they could get their hands on them. So, that, I think, left a kind of psychic residue in our species and there were also, disasters, like sudden unexplained disasters, volcanoes or meteor strikes or floods or earthquakes that perhaps the ancient people, and still some insane moderns today, think of as, whether they're all insane or not, I can't say, but they thought of them as, the gods punishing us, like nature, and the divine beings would become angry with humans and would, slap them down. So those aspects of our historical development have had repercussions, and they led to this weird colonial idea that nature was something to be conquered, which I find both tragic and bizarre. Here's a couple of the ravens. Aww. Let's see if I'm actually displaying those birds well. I can't really tell because I can't see what the camera is displaying. Yeah. So I can't tell if the ravens are being shown or not. And I think the birds nearby are mostly crows. So these two birds, I think, are ravens. They're awesome. The origins of consciousness in our species are not the results of technology. They're the results of relationships. And I would argue that one of there's a number of features that are unique to the kind of animal we are, particularly our opposable thumbs in our hands, our capacity to walk upright, our ability to eventually to build tools and shelter because of our unusually formed hands. These things can be argued to have been technological, and they certainly deeply impacted our cognitive evolution, the evolution of consciousness in our species. And they continue to today in ways that are often as terrifying as they are astonishing. And ways that, again, pose the significant threat of eliminating our species or permanently damaging the atmospheric envelope of the planet, or even wiping out life on Earth. I think very few people who are careful thinkers believe that our species has the capacity to end life on Earth, but I'm fairly certain we do. There are very specifically delicate aspects of the terrestrial environment that are subject to catastrophic destabilization. Now, it's conceivable that if we return the planet to some kind of magmic, lava-like state, a not inconceivable eventuality, with no atmosphere, that there'd be nothing alive here. But it's also conceivable that we could wipe out all the complex life and be left with a planet capable of sustaining only the microbial life, or certain forms of microbial life. And complex plants and animals would disappear forever. These seem to me to be realistically conceivable dangers, and I can even think of ways that a relatively small and not particularly adept group of humans might be able to pull that off if that became their goal. I'll keep those ideas to myself until I go to the grave, because some of them are a little too accessible. And unfortunately, modern humans, it's very uncommon that they can imagine a weapon that they won't build. Our desire to conquer or have victory over some other group or situation is a very conflicted desire that can easily end up with us conquering the capacity for us to survive anymore, in case this isn't obvious, right? One of the fascinating avenues of exploration in, war is a way of knowing as well. Combat is a way of knowing. In fact, some men who fight would argue that you really don't know a guy till you've been in a brawl with him. And some other men might argue that you really don't know a guy till you've had sex with him. And some women might argue something similar about men or women, or, they might argue about fighting, something similar. And it's not entirely untrue. Like I said, fighting is a way of knowing. Even when we have verbal, conflicts, and we yell and maybe bang on things, hopefully not people or animals or anything alive. And we're learning. We learn because when we slip beyond the mask of calm relation, when we allow the highly charged, formidable emotions to rise and sort of take control to some degree of the vehicle of our voices and our bodies, then we get an unusually intimate experience of what's been hiding underneath that calm, seemingly calm surface. And that's an important aspect of our humanity. We can't simply ignore it or wish it away. Some people would argue that we want to have victory over that we need to that we need to conquer our desire for violent conflict. And there are wonderful arguments for this, many of which I find quite compelling. I tend to be a relatively calm and gentle person myself. Kindness and mercy are values that I deeply admire and strive to embody. Yet there are situations in which I would set them aside for the sake of protecting or defending someone or myself, or my way of life, or something like this. At least conceivably. Very rarely have I ever been challenged to actually do so. Almost never. Though I have in my imagination. Perhaps most of us have. Many of us anyway. So there is, strangely, in our species, this underlying thread of violence as a kind of intimacy, or perhaps a replacement for intimacies we've suffered the losses of. Now, I have many perspectives on the origins of the modern consciousness that most of us, or many of us, experience today, participate in today. And I don't necessarily think of it as something that happens to us. It's really, whatever our consciousness is, it's like part nature, part nurture, part habit. Our minds become what we do most commonly with them, and their qualities and characters derive from the purposes for which we enact what we might refer to as the shaping of awareness or consciousness. And it has always been thus. And one of the things I was suggesting earlier is that the purposes familiar to the settled city builders were radically different than the purposes familiar to the nomadic tribes. And that over time these two things continued to diverge, and the city builders became conquerors. Whereas the tribes were not terribly interested in conquering, although perhaps in areas where there was a combination of tribal and superculture, there were combinations of these two modes. Wherever there were cities, apparently in the ancient world, they at least occasionally went to war. So we have to come to terms with that somehow. And it's not my intention to explain it at the moment. Except that perhaps, well, there's an aspect of my thought. By the way, these are, I'm going to switch topics dramatically here for a moment. These are Salvia Flowers. And if you pull one of these out of its bracket, right, you get something like this. Right? And you can get a droplet of nectar. It's really good. It's very sagey. And each kind of salvia flower like that produces a different flavor of nectar. But yeah, it's more nectar than in a honeysuckle. I don't deeply understand the origins of violence and war in our species. One could pragmatically argue, for example, that it's a kind of control valve for overpopulation or something like this, but I think that's an insufficient argument. And I also think that some of the ceremonies and traditions of the city builders, for example, the tradition that we refer to in modern times as human sacrifice, which might have been called a very different thing by those people. Those traditions and ceremonies have complex underpinnings we are not in a position to properly understand. But one of them might have been the awareness that the imposition of a city on the face of the living land was an extremely costly and devastating endeavor that required the obliteration of many, many living beings, many animals, many plants every day to sustain it. And so, in an effort to acquire the forgiveness of the land or the sun or the holy beings, the sun and the moon, the morning star, the companion star, the sky beings, that would certainly visit destruction justifiably on people who only took, right? We gave something back of our own, something precious to us. We gave it back. Now, to the modern mind, this could sound insane. And perhaps there is some insanity in there. I don't know. But I also know that we didn't live in the world they live in. And we presume, with our modern rational minds, that the world was always the same thing. The sky was always the same thing. Humans were always the same thing. It cannot be so. It simply cannot be so. And while it may be very difficult to say what they were, if they were not just as they are today, identity in human thought and experience, understanding, relation, and knowledge is very, very sophisticated manifold. It's not a single derivable thing, and it can't be merely rational for reasons that I'm not prepared to delve into at length at the moment. For something to be rational, it requires a secondary aspect capable of determining whether the thing qualifies as rational or not, and that secondary aspect is not merely rational, in my view, and the view of other intelligent people who I find some consonance with their perspectives. There is something hopeful in my long and passionate exploration of the origins of human consciousness and intelligence, understanding and awareness. And that is that when I began to wonder what it was that the ancient people saw when they looked to the sky, it did not immediately occur to me that I might be able to have the experience they had. But I think it's conceivable. And the reason that I think it's conceivable is that whatever we call our mind is, much like our human body, all of the ages we have ever been. And so somehow, it seems to me, I'm not trying to convince anyone of this. I'm merely suggesting it to those intrepid enough to explore in this direction. We contain the minds of our ancestors. And there are certain kinds of motivations, circumstances, and experiences that will ignite those potentials in us, that will draw them up from their labyrinthine submergence in us, and they will emerge directly in the consciousness we have in the moment as our own minds. And that's very hopeful, because I'm interested, I want to know the scope and breadth of my humanity and of the humanity of others. And I want to know how we became as we are today, how we were in days of yore, what are our potentials, what are the possibilities. And without having direct access to a vast array of ways of knowing, I think we become very narrowly trapped in perspectives, occupations, and mindsets that are impoverished compared to our deepest essence, our nature, our potential, our passionate desire. Yeah. We live in a world where our deepest instinctual yearnings are overpowered by representations and superficiality and fashion and opinion, nonsense, information. Literally something that has some kind of gravity that draws us into a formation with other human beings that is unworthy of embodying. So I want to know the breadth and scope of our capacities for intelligence, and I want to know the history of our minds. I want to know the origins of not just my own soul, but of life on Earth, of the family of terrestrial organisms, a family that I see fundamentally as unified. I see it as one thing first, and only separable as a convenience of language or representational thought, distinction. Yeah? I want to know the soul of the world. I want to know the soul of the sky. I want to know the origins of the most profound emotions that have moved me in brief moments throughout my life, and sometimes become storms of ecstasy that led me far beyond anything I imagined possible for my mind, into places so astonishing that compared to them, the sum of stories that I had ever been exposed to were almost meaningless. I want to learn. I want to learn to see. I want to clarify that sight. I want to be free of the kinds of blindness that have infected human minds for eons, and that are particularly contagious and popular in the time in which I live now. And if you do too, then please be encouraged and reassured, for I say that you contain the minds of the ancients, and that they are within you accessible. And though I will not tell you precisely how to seek or activate them, I will say this much. a noble purpose, passionately held. Through success and failure, through hardship and confusion, a truly noble purpose, truly passionately held, is an excellent catalyst for contact with the minds that dwell unseen and largely unacknowledged in all of us. Wise dreams to you for now.